Welcome to Sleeplore. Tonight, we will drift through the entire span of ancient Egypt, moving slowly and chronologically from the first ripples of the Nile to the final sunset of the Queens. As we witness the building of the pyramids and the rise of great empires, let the weight of these ancient stones relax your body, and the flow of the river quiet your mind. This is more than a history. It is a 3,000-year lullaby designed to carry you into the deepest part of the night. Close your eyes now and let the Valley of the Forever embrace you. The silence of the ancient world is a heavy and beautiful thing. Before the first cities were built and before the first kings were named, there was only the long and patient waiting of the earth. Time stretched out across the horizon like the endless sands, and the only sound was the wind as it moved through the dry grasses of the valley. You are resting in a place where the air is still and the light is soft and gold. Far to the south, the great river begins its journey and flows through the heart of a silent continent. It is a river of life, and it carries within its depths the story of the world. For ages beyond counting, the water rose and fell in a rhythm that was as steady as the breath of a sleeping child. The land was a ribbon of green held between the vast and empty deserts, and it was here that the first people found their home. They were simple and they were quiet, and they lived in harmony with the cycles of the sun and the stars. They walked upon the soft mud of the riverbanks, and they felt the coolness of the water against their skin. There was no sense of urgency, and there was no desire to conquer the landscape. They were content to be a part of the world and to follow the path that the river had carved for them. In the long afternoons, they watched the white birds fly over the reeds, and they listened to the rustle of the palms. Every year when the heat of the summer was at its peak, the river would begin to swell. It would rise slowly and surely until it overflowed its banks and covered the parched earth with a layer of dark and rich silt. This was the great miracle of the valley, and it happened with such regularity that it became the foundation of all thought. The people did not fear the water because they knew that it brought the gift of life. They waited for the flood with a patient hope, and they celebrated when the first ripples touched the edges of their fields. When the water finally receded, it left behind a world that was ready to bloom. They pushed their seeds into the moist ground, and they watched as the green shoots reached up toward the warmth of the sun. It was a simple life of planting and harvesting and resting while the earth did its work. They lived in small dwellings made of the river's own bounty, and they gathered together in the evenings to share the stories of the day. There was a growing sense of community and a shared understanding that they were all children of the same river. They began to notice the patterns of the stars, and they saw how the heavens mirrored the changes on the earth. The great belt of light in the night sky was like a river of stars, and they felt a deep connection to the mysteries of the universe. As the centuries turned into millennia, the people became more skilled in the ways of the land. They learned to dig small channels to carry the water further into the desert, and they built walls of mud to protect their homes from the rising tide. These small acts of cooperation were the seeds of something much larger. They were the first steps toward an order that would endure for thousands of years. They began to organize their labor and to plan for the seasons ahead, and they found strength in their unity. There was no need for force or for grand displays of power, because the river taught them everything they needed to know about balance and flow. The valley was a sanctuary of peace in a world that was still wild and untamed. They looked to the mountains in the east where the sun was born, and they looked to the hills in the west where the sun went to rest, and they saw a perfect circle. Life was not a straight line, but a repeating loop, and there was great comfort in knowing that tomorrow would be like today. The shadows grew long across the fields, and the sound of the water was a constant lullaby. You can imagine the smell of the damp earth and the coolness of the evening air as the stars begin to appear one by one. The world is slow, and the world is ancient, and you are drifting through the long corridors of time. There is no weight in your limbs, and there is no noise in your mind. There is only the river and the land, and the steady pulse of a civilization that is just beginning to breathe. They began to keep track of the years by the height of the flood, and they began to mark the passing of the months by the changing face of the moon. Everything was connected, and everything had its place within the great design. The hunter-gatherers of the past had become the farmers of the present, and they were weaving the first threads of a rich and vibrant tapestry. They respected the animals that lived alongside them, and they saw the spirit of the divine in the strength of the bull and the grace of the cat. The world was filled with wonder, and every sunrise was a gift from a source they were only beginning to name. They worked with the stone, and they worked with the clay, and they found beauty in the simple shapes of the natural world. There was a stillness in their hearts that matched the stillness of the desert. They were not afraid of the vastness of the space around them, because the river was always there to guide them home. It was a time of deep preparation and a time of quiet reflection. The energy of the people was focused on the preservation of life and the honoring of the cycles that sustained them. They understood that to live well was to live in accordance with the laws of the river. The water did not hurry, and yet everything was accomplished. The small gatherings of homes along the river began to grow, and the paths between them became wider and more familiar as the generations passed. Where once there were only isolated clusters of reeds and mud, there were now the beginnings of towns and the voices of many people working toward a single purpose. The river remained the center of all things, and it was the great highway that connected the north to the south and the south to the north. Boats made of bundled papyrus began to drift upon the current, carrying the treasures of one village to the next, and the people began to realize that they were not alone in their love for the valley. There was a sharing of ideas, and a sharing of stones, and a sharing of the sacred stories that explained the rising of the sun. In the north, the land opened up like a wide green fan, where the river branched into many smaller streams before meeting the sea. This was a place of soft mists and low horizons, where the earth was always damp and the air was thick with the scent of salt and flowering plants. In the south, the valley remained narrow and protected by high golden cliffs that stood like silent guardians against the heat of the desert. These two worlds were different, and yet they were bound by the same silver thread of water and the same cycle of the seasons. As the communities grew, they began to look for leaders who could manage the grain and ensure that the water reached every field during the dry months. These were the first keepers of the order, and they held a great responsibility to maintain the balance of the land. They did not rule with iron or with anger, but with a quiet understanding of the needs of the earth and the needs of the people. Small districts began to form, and each one had its own spirit and its own symbol that represented the character of the local landscape. One might be the land of the hawk, and another might be the land of the serpent, but they all looked toward the river as their ultimate provider. The idea of a single identity began to form in the minds of the people, like a seed taking root in the fertile mud. They began to speak of the two lands as a single entity, and they dreamed of a time when the entire valley would move as one body. This process was as slow and as inevitable as the movement of a glacier or the growth of an ancient tree. There was no sudden war or dramatic change, but rather a gradual merging of shadows until the light of unity began to shine through. The people of the north, with their green marshes, and the people of the south, with their white mountains, began to find common ground in their shared history and their shared future. They began to build larger structures of brick and stone to house their harvests and to honor the forces that they felt moving through the wind and the water. They looked at the horizon, and they saw the necessity of a central point of gravity that could hold the world together. The concept of the great house began to emerge, where a single figure would stand as the bridge between the heavens and the earth. This person would not be a mere man, but a living vessel for the harmony of the universe, and their presence would ensure that the river continued to rise and the sun continued to shine. The air in the valley felt heavy with anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath before a great awakening. The individual villages began to yield their autonomy to the larger vision of a unified kingdom, and the boundaries between the districts became the veins that carried the lifeblood of a new civilization. They began to craft symbols of authority, such as the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. And they understood that when these two symbols were joined, the world would be complete. The repetition of daily life continued, but it was now infused with a sense of higher purpose and a feeling of belonging to something that would outlast the span of a single human life. They were no longer just survivors of the wilderness, but the architects of a lasting peace. You can feel the weight of this growing stability as you rest in the cradle of the ancient world. The movement toward unification was like the coming together of two great rivers that flow side by side before finally merging into a single, powerful stream. There was a profound silence in the desert as the first foundations of the great cities were laid and the first names were carved into the memory of the stone. The land was becoming a temple, and every action was a form of prayer. The people moved with a deliberate slowness, and they respected the time it took for greatness to mature. They were not in a hurry to build monuments, because they knew that their greatest monument would be the continuity of their way of life. The stars continued to turn in their celestial dance, and the river continued to carry the silt of the mountains to the fields of the valley. Everything was moving toward a moment of perfect alignment, and the heartbeat of the land was becoming the heartbeat of a nation. The two lands were reaching out to one another like lovers in the dark, and the air was filled with the promise of a golden age that was just beyond the horizon. The moment of joining arrived not as a sudden storm, but as the quiet rising of the sun over the eastern mountains. After the long ages of preparation, the two halves of the world finally found their center, and the two crowns were placed upon a single brow. This was the birth of a new kind of existence, where the strength of the South and the wisdom of the North were woven into a single garment of sovereignty. The first king stood as the guardian of this sacred union, and his name was whispered like a prayer by those who lived in the shadow of the cliffs and those who walked the marshes of the delta. He was the shepherd of the people, and the one who ensured that the great rhythm of the river remained undisturbed by the chaos of the outer world. To mark this new era, a city was founded at the very point where the valley meets the fan of the river's mouth. This was the place of the White Walls, a city built upon the high ground that overlooked the convergence of the two lands. It was a place of balance and a place of beauty, where the limestone shimmered in the heat and the palm trees provided a deep and cooling shade. From this central heart, the instructions of the king flowed outward like the waters of the inundation, reaching every corner of the kingdom. The people looked toward the white walls as the anchor of their world, and they felt a profound sense of security in the knowledge that someone was watching over the stars and the seasons. The king was the master of the flood and the companion of the gods, and his presence meant that the cycles of life would never fail. This was the establishment of an order that felt as permanent as the sun itself. It was the beginning of a record that would never be broken, and the stories of the people were now the stories of the kingdom. They began to develop a way of speaking with symbols and signs, carving the essence of their thoughts into the very bone of the earth. These early marks were not just accounts of grain and cattle, but echoes of the eternal truth that they saw all around them. They carved the shape of the water and the shape of the bird and the shape of the reed, and they found that their words could live forever. The transition into this organized way of life was smooth and silent, like the movement of a boat across a glassy lake. There was a deep respect for the ancestors who had walked the land before them, and a commitment to preserving the peace that had been so carefully built. The court of the king was not a place of noise or vanity, but a sanctuary of quiet deliberation, where the laws of nature were translated into the laws of man. They understood that to serve the king was to serve the river, and to serve the river was to serve the soul of the world. The nights in the new capital were filled with the soft glow of oil lamps and the distant sound of the water lapping against the stone quays. The people slept with the assurance that the morning would bring the same light and the same hope that had sustained their fathers. The desert remained a vast and mysterious presence, but it no longer felt like a threat to their existence. It was the container for their sanctuary, the silent witness to the greatness that was unfolding within the valley. The kings of the first days were builders of foundations, laying the stones that would support the weight of thousands of years of history. They moved with a slow and steady grace, and they did not rush toward the future because they knew that they were already living in the center of eternity. The unification was complete, and the two lands were now one breath and one heart and one destiny. You can feel the stillness of this new world as the shadows lengthen across the white walls of the city, and the river carries the reflection of the rising moon toward the sea. Every stone is in its place, and every star is in its course, and you are drifting deeper into the long and peaceful memory of the land. The sense of permanence grew as the first great tombs were constructed in the silent desert beyond the reach of the floodwaters. These were the houses of eternity, where the spirit of the kings would dwell forever, watching over the people they had joined together. The stone was cut with such precision and such care that it seemed to grow out of the earth itself, and the silence of the plateau was a testament to the scale of their vision. They were building for a time that had no end, and they were creating a world where death was not a departure, but a continuation of the great journey. The rhythm of the work was slow and steady, and the workers moved with a sense of quiet devotion, knowing that they were part of a sacred task. The valley was now a single temple, and the river was the path that led to the divine. The first dynasty was like the morning star that appears before the full brightness of the day, and its light was enough to guide the people through the long centuries to come. Everything was in balance, and everything was in its place, and the story of the two lands had finally begun. The centuries began to turn, like the wheels of a great and silent chariot moving across the floor of heaven. The foundations of the two lands were now deep and firm, and the people lived in a world that felt as though it had always existed and would never truly end. This was the time of the great flowering, when the wisdom of the early days became the strength of a golden age. The kings were no longer merely leaders of men, but were seen as the living breath of the gods, walking upon the earth to maintain the balance of all things. This balance was a quiet and holy thing, called the order of the world. And it was the duty of every soul, from the highest official to the humblest farmer, to keep this harmony alive. As the kingdom grew more confident, they began to look toward the stone of the mountains with new eyes. They no longer wished to build only with the mud of the river, which returned to the earth after a few generations. They sought a material that could hold the memory of their devotion for 1,000 years. They turned to the limestone and the granite, and they began to learn the language of the rock. On a high plateau overlooking the green valley, a new kind of structure began to rise toward the clouds. It was not a flat tomb like those of the ancestors, but a series of layers reaching upward like a giant staircase made of light. Each step was a prayer, and each stone was a testament to the unity of the people. Thousands of hands worked together in a slow and rhythmic dance, moving the massive blocks from the quarries to the desert edge. There was no sound of shouting or the crack of the whip, but only the steady heave of the ropes and the low chant of the workers as they pulled in unison. They were not slaves to a tyrant, but participants in a cosmic work, believing that by building the house of the king, they were securing the safety of the entire universe. The air was filled with the fine white dust of the limestone and the smell of the sun on warm stone. When the first great staircase was complete, it stood as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the stars. It was a beacon of permanence in a world of change, and it marked the beginning of an era where the landscape itself would be reshaped by the vision of the people. As the years flowed onward, the shapes became even more refined, and the staircases smoothed into perfect slopes that mimicked the rays of the sun breaking through the clouds after a storm. On the plateau of the three giants, the earth groaned under the weight of mountains built by human hands. These were the true pyramids, and they stood in a silent row against the burning blue of the sky. They were covered in a casing of polished white stone that reflected the light so brightly it could be seen from miles away, like a fallen star resting upon the sand. Inside these mountains of rock, there were secret chambers and narrow corridors, filled with a silence so deep it felt like the beginning of time. The king was laid to rest in the heart of the stone, surrounded by the treasures of his life and the spells that would guide him through the darkness to the fields of eternal peace. Outside, the world continued its slow and beautiful rotation. The river rose and fell, and the people planted and harvested, and the life of the valley remained unchanged by the passage of centuries. There was a sense of profound stillness at the center of the kingdom, as if the great weight of the pyramids had anchored the land to the floor of the cosmos. The art of the people became more delicate and more certain as they carved the images of their lives into the walls of the tombs. They showed the birds in the thickets, and the cattle crossing the water, and the fishermen casting their nets into the stream. They wanted to capture the beauty of the present moment and hold it forever, so that even in the distant future, the world would know how the light had looked on the leaves of the lotus. This was the peak of the old ways, a time of absolute certainty and quiet power. The wealth of the land was measured not just in gold or grain, but in the depth of its peace. The horizon was a line of perfect geometry, and the desert was a garden of stone. You are walking through the shadows of these great monuments, and you can feel the coolness that radiates from the deep rock. The sun is high, and the air is still, and the only sound is the distant hum of the valley far below. The kingdom has reached its maturity, and it stands in the light of its own creation, proud and patient and eternal. The stars in the north never set, and they were called the ones who know no weariness, and the people looked to them as a map of their own journey. Everything was connected in a web of light and stone and water. The great silence of the old kingdom is a blanket that covers the earth, and you are resting in its warm and heavy folds. The story of the builders is the story of a dream that became a mountain, and you are drifting through the halls of that dream as it stretches out toward the horizon of the forever. The great age of the stone mountains had reached its full afternoon, and the light was beginning to change in ways that were hard to name. The world was very old now, and the memory of the first unification was like a dream told by a grandfather to a child who is already half asleep. The peace of the valley had lasted for so long that it felt as though the very earth was weary of its own perfection. The king, who had ruled for many decades, was like a quiet shadow moving through the halls of his palace, and his eyes had seen the rising and setting of the sun more times than anyone could count. He was a pillar of the world, but even the strongest pillar can feel the weight of the sky as the evening draws near. In the lands far to the south and the north, the governors of the small districts began to look at their own reflections in the water, and they saw the faces of men who were no longer just servants of a distant throne. They saw themselves as the keepers of their own small worlds, and they began to build their own tombs in the cliffs near their homes instead of traveling to the great city. This shift was as subtle as the turning of a leaf in the autumn wind, and for a long time, the rhythm of life seemed to continue as it always had. The farmers still walked to the fields, and the birds still nested in the reeds, but the spirit of the land was becoming fragmented, like a mirror that had been gently cracked. The great projects of the stone mountains began to slow down, and the sound of the chisel against the rock was heard less often in the desert silence. The focus of the people was turning inward toward their own families and their own small pieces of earth, and the vast unity of the past was beginning to fade into the mist. It was a time of long waiting and a time of quiet change. Then there came a season when the river did not rise with its usual strength. The people stood on the banks, and they looked to the south with eyes full of hope, but the water remained low, and the mud was not as dark or as rich as it had been in the years of plenty. The great miracle of the flood, which had been the heartbeat of the world for thousands of years, was suddenly faint and uncertain. The green ribbon of the valley began to shrink, and the golden sands of the desert moved a few steps closer to the homes of the people. There was no panic or loud crying in the streets, but there was a deep and heavy silence that fell over the land like a thick blanket. The granaries, which had been full for generations, were slowly emptied, and the people learned the meaning of a thin harvest. The river, which had always been the source of all joy, began to grow narrow and thin. The banks where the green reeds once danced in the wind became dry and brittle, and the mud cracked into patterns that looked like the ancient skin of a desert creature. They shared what they had, and they looked to the sky for a sign, but the stars remained cold and distant in their celestial paths. The central power in the white walls was like a lamp that was running out of oil, and its light was no longer strong enough to reach the far corners of the kingdom. The order of the world was bending under the pressure of the changing earth, and the harmony that had been the pride of the old kingdom was beginning to fray at the edges. This was a period of shadows, and a period of testing, where the strength of the soul was more important than the strength of the stone. The people began to move from one place to another, seeking the water that was no longer where it used to be, and the old boundaries were forgotten in the struggle for life. Yet even in this time of thinning, the essence of the culture remained. They still carved their prayers into the wood and the clay, and they still looked toward the west as the place of resting. The silence of the desert became even more profound as the Great Pyramid stood empty and quiet, watching over a land that was trying to find its way in the dark. It was as if the earth was taking a long and difficult breath before it could begin to bloom again. The sense of a single destiny had been lost for a while, and the two lands were once again like two separate people who had forgotten how to speak the same language. Small kings rose up in different cities, each claiming to be the true protector of the order, but their voices were small against the vastness of the silence. They were the ones who saw the empty granaries and the dry fields every day, and they felt the weight of the people's needs upon their own shoulders. The world felt smaller and more intimate, and the grand visions of the past were replaced by the simple necessity of the present. You are resting in this world of long shadows, and you can feel the coolness of the air as the sun dips below the horizon of the old age. The heat of the day is gone, and the world is preparing for a sleep that will last for a long time. There is no fear in this transition, only a sense of profound exhaustion and a need for stillness. The river is a silver thread in the moonlight, and the stars are the only constants in a landscape that is shifting and changing. The memories of the great builders are like ghosts in the wind, and the dust of the limestone is settling upon the paths that were once crowded with workers. The land is resting, and the people are resting, and the story of the first great flowering is coming to a close. But even in the deepest part of the night, there is the knowledge that the sun will eventually return. The earth is not dying, but is merely lying fallow, waiting for the next great rising of the water. The silence is a sanctuary where the seeds of the future are being kept warm in the dark. You are drifting in this space between the ages, where the old is passing away and the new has not yet been born. The air is still and the world is quiet, and you are part of the long and patient waiting of the valley. Everything is slow and everything is rhythmic, and the pulse of history is a lullaby that carries you deeper into the heart of the ancient night. The shadows are long and soft, and they fold around you like the wings of a great bird protecting its nest from the cold. The river flows on, and the stars turn on, and the world is safe in the hands of time. The long years of the thinning river and the broken unity began to fade like a heavy mist at the first touch of the morning sun. In the southern city of Waset, which the world would later call Thebes, a new line of princes began to look upon the valley with a quiet and steady determination. They were the heirs of the old traditions, and they felt the ancient blood of the two lands stirring in their veins. A prince named Mentuhotep, whose name carried the peaceful strength of the god of war, arose from the south and began the slow and patient task of gathering the scattered pieces of the kingdom. This was not a work of sudden violence, but a gradual weaving of threads that had been loose for generations. He moved with the deliberation of a man who knows that a house built in haste will not stand the winter winds. Under his hand, the north and the south were once again stitched together into a single garment of sovereignty, and the title of the unifier was given to him by a grateful people. The water of the river seemed to remember its old paths, and the inundation returned with a newfound strength, filling the cracked earth with the dark and heavy mud that smelled of life and old stone. The middle age of the kingdom began to bloom in the gardens of Waset, and the architecture of the land took on a new and more graceful form. At the edge of the desert, near the high cliffs of the west, the king built a temple and a tomb that was unlike anything seen before, with long colonnades that mirrored the vertical lines of the mountains. It was a time of restoration, where the wisdom of the past was reclaimed and refined by a generation that had known the cost of chaos. The kings of this era began to appoint officials who were chosen for their skill and their loyalty, and the old districts were brought back into the fold of the central order. They moved the capital northward to a place called Ich-Tawi, which meant the one who takes hold of the two lands. And there they established a seat of power that was balanced between the delta and the valley. The writing of the people became more beautiful and more complex as they recorded the stories of their journeys and the teachings of their sages. This was the true classical age of the tongue, where the language was used to explore the depths of the human heart and the mysteries of the divine. They wrote on scrolls of papyrus about the adventures of sailors and the wisdom of old men. And they believed that a well-chosen word could live longer than a block of granite. There was a shift in the way the people looked at the afterlife, and the god Osiris began to rise in the hearts of the many. In the old days, the hope of eternity had been a gift reserved mostly for the kings. But now, the promise of the fields of reeds was offered to every soul who lived a life of balance and truth. They journeyed to the sacred city of Abydos to touch the earth where they believed the god of the dead was laid to rest. And they left behind small monuments of clay and stone to mark their presence. The kings of the 12th dynasty, such as the great Amenemhat and the wise Senusret, were like shepherds who watched over their flock with a constant and weary eye. They did not just build for their own glory, but they built for the survival of the land. They turned their gaze toward the wide depression of the Fayum, where they dug massive channels to drain the marshes and create a new garden in the heart of the desert. This was a work of immense patience, and it transformed the landscape into a fertile province that could feed the kingdom even in the years when the river was low. They built pyramids again, but these were different from the giants of the past, being made of mud brick and encased in white limestone. And they sat among the new fields like silent guardians of the harvest. The borders of the land were pushed further south into the golden hills of Kush, where the kings built massive fortresses of brick to protect the trade in gold and ivory and incense. These walls were thick and strong, and they stood as a testament to the growing reach of the Egyptian spirit. The people lived in a world that was organized and secure, and they felt the presence of the king in every grain of wheat and every drop of water. They were no longer afraid of the dark years, because they had seen that the order could be restored and that the river would always return. The craftsmen in the workshops produced jewelry of such delicate beauty that it seemed to be made of starlight and colored glass. And the painters filled the tombs with scenes of festivals and music and dancing. It was an age of high culture and deep reflection, where the grandeur of the pyramids was matched by the refinement of the soul. The kings were portrayed in stone, with faces that showed the weight of their responsibility, with lines of care around their eyes, and a look of profound contemplation. They were the weary watchers who kept the world from falling back into the shadows. You are drifting through the halls of these middle years, where the light is soft and the voices are low and melodic. The valley is a place of steady work and quiet satisfaction, and the rhythm of the day is governed by the sound of the water moving through the new irrigation canals. The desert is a distant friend, and the river is an eternal brother. The continuity of the two lands is a heavy and comforting blanket, and you are tucked beneath its folds as the sun begins its slow descent toward the western horizon. The stories of the sages are being whispered in the evening air, and the scent of the lotus is rising from the pools of the garden. Everything is in its proper place, and the kingdom is breathing with a slow and rhythmic heart. You are safe in the memory of the land, and you are a part of the long and beautiful story that never truly ends. The centuries moved like the heavy waters of the river, and the quiet stability of the Middle Years began to shift once again as the world beyond the valley started to press against the borders. To the east, across the burning sands of the Sinai, a different kind of people had been watching the green sanctuary of the Nile for a long time. These were the Hekau Kasut, whom the stories call the rulers of the foreign lands, and they did not come with the slow pace of the farmer or the quiet prayer of the priest. They brought with them a new and thundering sound that the valley had never known, the sound of horses and the spinning of the wheel. The chariot was a circle of wood and bronze that moved faster than the current of the river, and it changed the way the people thought about the distance and the wind. For a time, the unity of the two lands was broken once more, and a new capital rose in the north at a place called Avaris, in the fertile moan of the delta. The kings of the old line remained in the south, in the city of Thebes, held between the high cliffs and the sacred stream, while the north was governed by those who had come from the eastern sunrise. This was a season of quiet tension and a slow gathering of strength, where the people of the valley learned the ways of the bronze and the bow. It was not a time of darkness, but a time of transition, where the isolation of the past was being replaced by a connection to the wider world. In the houses of Thebes, a family of princes began to dream of a valley that was whole again, and they studied the movements of the horse and the strength of the new weapons. The king named Sekenenre-Tau and his sons Kamose and Amose were like the rising tide that cannot be held back by any wall of sand. They began a long and patient movement toward the north, reclaiming the river mile by mile and village by village. It was a journey of many years, and it required the heart of a lion and the patience of the stone. When the young Amose finally drove the foreign rulers back into the desert, the two lands were joined in a way that was stronger and more vibrant than ever before. This was the dawn of the new kingdom, an era where the valley would no longer be a hidden sanctuary, but a great light that shone across the face of the earth. The kings of this new age were warriors and builders who sought to touch the very edges of the world. They led their armies far into the north toward the great river that flows backward, and they ventured deep into the south to the lands of the incense and the gold. The wealth of many nations began to flow into the city of Thebes, making it the most magnificent jewel of the ancient world. The god Amun, who had once been a quiet spirit of the wind, was now the king of the gods, and his temple at Karnak began to grow into a forest of stone pillars that reached toward the heavens. Every king added a new hall or a new gateway to this sacred place, and the sound of the chisel and the hammer was a constant music in the air. The valley was filled with the sense of foreign spices and the sight of strange animals, and the people felt the pulse of a vast and growing empire. Yet even in this time of movement and expansion, the old rhythms remained. The farmer still looked to the river for his life, and the priest still offered the morning water to the sun. The kings were now buried in a secret valley behind the western cliffs, where the silence was guarded by the peak of the mountain that looks like a pyramid of nature. This was the Valley of the Kings, a place of hidden chambers and golden light, where the rulers of the empire went to rest in the heart of the rock. The walls of these tombs were covered in paintings of deep blue and vibrant gold, showing the journey of the sun through the 12 hours of the night. They no longer built mountains of stone on the plateau, but they carved their immortality into the living bone of the earth. It was a time of great queens as well, such as the woman king Hatshepsut, who built a temple of white terraces that seemed to emerge from the very cliffs of the west. She sent her ships to the distant land of Punt, and they returned with trees of myrrh and heaps of electrum, and the people marveled at the bounty of the world. The air was warm, and the land was rich, and the story of Egypt was reaching its highest and most brilliant summer. The chariots moved across the desert like golden sparks, and the river carried the heavy ships of the empire from one end of the world to the other. You are resting in the shade of a great pylon, and the sound of the distant city is like the humming of a hive of bees. The world is large and full of wonder, and the order of the land is as firm as the granite of the obelisks that point toward the sun. The shadows of the empire are long and majestic, and they fold around the valley in a protective embrace. Everything is moving with a new and powerful energy, and yet the heart of the land is still and peaceful. You are drifting through the golden streets of Thebes, and the scent of the blue lotus is heavy in the evening air. The stars are the same stars that watched over the first farmers, and the river is the same river that brought the first mud to the valley. The continuity of life is a silver cord that binds the past to the present, and you are held safely within its strength. The sun is setting over the mountains of the west, and the light is turning the river into a stream of molten gold. The story of the great kings is a story of vision and courage, and you are part of the long and beautiful dream of the empire. The golden age of the new kingdom had reached a point of such immense weight and beauty that it seemed as though it might remain unchanged forever. The city of Thebes was the beating heart of the world, and its temples were filled with the silent presence of many gods who had guarded the valley for thousands of years. But in the midst of this perfection, a young king named Amenhotep IV looked toward the horizon and saw a different kind of light. He did not see the gods in the shapes of animals or humans, but he saw the divine in the pure and radiant energy of the sun disk itself, which he called the Aten. This vision was so powerful that it moved him to change his own name to Akhenaten, and to turn his back on the ancient traditions of his fathers. He felt that the old temples had become too heavy with the weight of the past, and he sought a place where the light was clear and the air was untouched by the breath of the centuries. He led his court away from the shaded gardens of Thebes and into a wide and empty bay in the desert, which he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the sun. This new city rose from the sand with a startling speed, built of mud brick and white stone, and filled with open-air altars where the light could fall directly upon the offerings. The art of this time became soft and natural and strangely intimate, showing the king and his beautiful queen Nefertiti as they played with their children under the reaching hands of the sun. It was a brief and shimmering moment, where the world seemed to pause in a dream of light and wind. But the desert is a patient witness, and the old gods were not so easily forgotten by the people who still carried the memory of the river in their bones. When the Sun King passed away, the desert city was slowly abandoned to the wind and the sand, and the court returned to the familiar shadows of Thebes. A young boy named Tutankhaten was placed upon the throne, and his name was changed to Tutankhamen, to signal the return of the ancient god Amun to his rightful place. He was a child of the Restoration, and his brief reign was spent repairing the broken links of the past and reawakening the silence of the old temples. Although he did not live to see the full maturity of his years, his name would become a legend in a time far beyond his own. He was laid to rest in a small and hidden chamber in the Valley of the Kings, and the doors were sealed with the silence of the earth. For thousands of years, he slept in a room filled with the golden shadows of chariots and thrones and masks of pure gold, while the history of the world moved on without him. The transition into the next era was guided by the steady hand of an old general named Horemheb, who cleared away the last traces of the Sun King's dream and prepared the land for a new line of warriors. This was the beginning of the 19th dynasty, a time of immense strength and monumental vision. A new family of kings arose from the north, near the ancient lands of the Delta, and they took the name of Ramses to honor the power of the sun. The second king of this name, Ramses the Great, would rule the valley for 66 long and prosperous years, becoming the living symbol of the empire's majesty. He was a builder of giants, and he moved the mountains themselves to proclaim his presence to the world. Far to the south, at a place called Abu Simbel, he carved 4 enormous images of himself into the living rock of the cliff, looking out over the river with a gaze that was both calm and terrifying. Twice a year, the rising sun would send a single beam of light deep into the heart of the mountain to touch the statues of the gods in the inner sanctuary. It was a masterpiece of geometry and devotion, a way of binding the movement of the heavens to the will of the king. Ramses led his chariots into the north to face the great powers of the east, and he returned to sign the first treaty of peace known to history. He was a man who understood that true greatness lay not just in the conquest of land, but in the stability of the people. He built a new capital in the Delta called P. Ramses, and he filled the land with so many monuments and statues that his name seemed to be written upon every stone in the valley. As he grew old, he watched his children and his grandchildren grow up around him, and he saw the kingdom reach a plateau of wealth and power that would never be surpassed. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of the sistrum in the temples, and the river was crowded with ships carrying the tribute of 100 nations. But even the longest summer must eventually feel the coming of the evening, and as the reign of the great Ramses came to a close, the shadows began to grow longer once again. The world was changing, and new peoples were moving across the seas and the deserts, seeking a place in the sun. The successors of the great king were forced to defend the borders with more frequency, and the resources of the land were stretched to their limits. The unity of the two lands, which had been the foundation of all things, began to feel the strain of the passing centuries. You are drifting through the halls of the great temples, where the columns are like giant papyrus stalks made of stone, and the ceilings are painted with the stars of the night sky. The weight of the history is around you like a warm and protective cloak, and the voices of the kings are like the distant murmur of the tide. The sun is setting over the great works of the Ramesside age, and the light is orange and red and deep purple. The river continues to flow, and the land continues to breathe, and the story of the empire is moving toward its final and most mysterious chapters. You are resting in the heart of the Golden Age, and the peace of the valley is your own peace. Everything is slow, and everything is certain, and the memory of the stone is a lullaby that carries you into the deep, and quiet dark. The heavy brilliance of the empire began to soften into the muted colors of a long and lingering twilight. The age of the great builders had passed, and the valley began to feel the weight of its own immense history, as the 13th century before the Common Era drew to a close. The successors of the great Ramses found themselves standing upon a stage that was changing in ways they could not always master. From the cold waters of the north and the rugged islands of the sea, new and restless peoples began to arrive in great ships, seeking the warmth and the wealth of the river. These were the sea peoples, and they moved like a storm across the Mediterranean, breaking the old kingdoms of the east and bringing a time of fire and iron. The king Ramses III stood as the final great defender of the valley, meeting the invaders at the edge of the delta and in the mountain passes of the north. He was victorious, and the land was saved from the storm. But the effort had drained the treasury and tired the spirit of the nation. The unity of the two lands began to unravel once more, not through war, but through a slow and quiet thinning of the central thread. The high priests of Amun in the city of Thebes grew so powerful that they began to rule the south as their own sacred domain, while the kings remained in the north at a new city called Tanis. This was the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, a time of many centers and many voices, where the valley was like a house with many rooms that no longer shared the same lamp. For several centuries, the land was governed by leaders who had their roots in the Libyan deserts to the west, bringing a new energy and a different perspective to the ancient throne. They respected the old ways, and they honored the gods of the river. But the world was becoming a more complicated place. To the south, in the land of Kush, the people who had once been the pupils of the Egyptian Empire became its protectors. A line of powerful black pharaohs arose from the city of Napata, near the holy mountain of Gebel Barkal, and they looked toward the north with the desire to restore the purity of the old traditions. They marched down the river not as conquerors, but as restorers of the faith, bringing with them a renewed devotion to the god Amun. For a brief and remarkable time, the kingdom stretched from the Mediterranean deep into the heart of Africa, and the 25th dynasty saw a rebirth of the ancient arts and the building of new pyramids in the sands of the south. But the world beyond the valley was now filled with the sound of iron and the march of the Assyrians, whose armies were like a flood of shadows from the north. The Kushite kings were forced to retreat to their southern homes, and the valley was left to find its way through a series of foreign encounters and brief moments of independence. There was a final flowering of the native spirit in the city of Sais, where the kings of the 26th dynasty looked back to the old kingdom for inspiration and tried to recreate the elegance of the pyramid age. They opened the doors of the valley to the travelers and traders of Greece, and the sounds of new languages began to be heard in the markets of the delta. But the great powers of the east were growing ever stronger, and the Persians arrived with their vast armies to claim the river as a province of their own empire. The sun was setting on the era of the native pharaohs, and the land was becoming a prize for the great conquerors of the world. Yet even under the rule of the Persians and the Greeks, the soul of the land remained unchanged. The temples were still the centers of life, and the priests still read the ancient scrolls, and the farmers still waited for the rising of the Nile. The river did not care for the names of the kings, and the sun did not change its path for the movement of armies. There was a profound and beautiful resilience in the culture that allowed it to absorb the new while keeping the core of its identity as solid as a block of granite. You are resting in this late afternoon of the ancient world, where the light is long and gold, and the shadows are deep and full of mystery. The sound of the river is a constant whisper, telling the stories of 3,000 years to the reeds and the palms. The air is cool, and the stars are starting to flicker over the ruins of the old cities. And there is a sense of peace that comes from knowing that the cycle will always continue. The land has seen everything, and it has survived everything, and it remains a sanctuary of stillness in a restless world. You are drifting through the quiet halls of the late temples, where the carvings are deep and the incense is thick, and the memory of the past is as heavy as the stone. The story is moving toward its final embrace with the world of the West, but the heartbeat of the valley is still the heartbeat of the river. Everything is slow and everything is rhythmic, and you are part of the long and patient waiting of the earth. The horizon was changing, and a new name was whispered by the wind that blew from the north across the wine-dark sea. A young king from the mountains of Macedon, whose name was Alexander, came to the valley not as a destroyer, but as a seeker of the ancient truth. He crossed the vast and silent deserts to find the hidden oasis of Siwa, where the oracle of Amun waited in the stillness of the palms. There the gods spoke to him as a father speaks to a son, and Alexander was crowned in the old way as the protector of the two lands. He stood at the edge of the sea where the river meets the salt, and he marked out the lines of a city that would become a beacon of light for all the world. This was Alexandria, a city of white stone and wide avenues where the wisdom of the Greeks and the mysteries of the Egyptians would live side by side in a long and fruitful peace. When Alexander passed into the stars, his general Ptolemy took up the double crown and began a new dynasty that would lead the land into its final and most brilliant afternoon. These new kings were foreign by birth, but they were Egyptian by heart, and they rebuilt the ancient temples with a scale and a detail that was breathtaking. At Edfu and Dendera and the beautiful island of Philae, they carved the old prayers into the stone with such depth and precision that the gods seemed to live within the walls once again. They spoke the language of the people, and they wore the traditional robes, and they honored the river as the source of all their wealth. In Alexandria, they built a great house of books, where all the knowledge of the earth was gathered under a single roof. The scholars walked in the quiet courtyards, and they studied the stars and the secrets of the human body, while the great lighthouse of the pharaohs cast its steady light across the waves. It was a time of intellectual flowering and a time of immense cultural wealth, where the old and the new were woven together like the threads of a fine linen cloth. But the world was once again becoming a place of giants, and the shadow of Rome began to stretch across the sea like the hand of a silent conqueror. The final flower of this long and beautiful line was a queen named Cleopatra VII, who was as wise as she was determined. She was the first of her line to speak the native tongue of the people, and she looked upon the valley with a love that was deep and ancient. She saw the storm that was coming from the west, and she tried to navigate the currents of power with the grace of a swan and the mind of a philosopher. She was the living image of Isis upon the earth, and she fought to keep the flame of the two lands burning in a world that was turning toward iron and law. The years of her reign were a time of high drama and quiet beauty, where the luxury of the court was matched by the devotion of the queen to her people. But the weight of Rome was too great to be held back forever, and the final chapter of the dynastic era began to close with the soft rustle of a turning page. When the last queen passed into the silence of the West, the land became a province of the Roman Empire, but its soul remained untouched by the change in masters. The grain of the valley fed the cities of the north, and the stones of the temples remained as a testament to a world that had mastered the art of eternity. The priests continued to offer the incense, and the farmers continued to wait for the flood, and the river continued to carry the story of the ancients toward the sea. Even as the old writing was forgotten and the temples fell into a long and dusty sleep, the spirit of Egypt lived on in the land and the people. The silence of the desert covered the pyramids once more, and the sand moved slowly to hide the secrets of the kings from the prying eyes of the future. You are resting at the very end of this long and beautiful journey, where the 3,000 years of the pharaohs have become a single and perfect memory. The light of the sun is fading over the western cliffs, and the stars are the only witnesses to the greatness that once walked the valley. The river is a path of silver in the darkness, and the wind is a lullaby that carries the echoes of the kings and the queens into the heart of the night. There is no more noise, and there is no more movement, only the steady and eternal breath of the earth. You are part of the continuity, and you are part of the peace, and you are held in the warm embrace of a civilization that never truly died. The story is complete, and the circle is closed, and the world is safe in the hands of time. The water flows, and the stars turn, and the land is quiet in its long and beautiful sleep. You are drifting deeper into the heart of the ancient silence, and the memory of the two lands is a dream that will never end. The long journey of the two lands has reached its final resting place, and the river flows silently into the dark. The names of the kings have faded, and the desert is still under the watching stars. You are drifting now in the peaceful memory of the valley where time has no weight. This journey with Sleeplore has come to a close, and the silence of the temples is your own. May the stillness of the ancient world bring you a deep and quiet rest. Good night, and sleep well.